It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The wedding venue was filled with joy, laughter, and the sound of celebration. Guests clinked their glasses, the music played, and Samantha Miller was glowing in her white dress. She had just said, "I do," to the love of her life, Eric Hutchinson. The newlyweds were surrounded by family and friends, dancing under the twinkling lights, completely unaware that their perfect night was about to turn into a nightmare. The wedding reception carried on late into the night. Everyone was still buzzing with excitement as Samantha and Eric prepared to leave. They had chosen a simple yet romantic way to exit the venue, a golf cart ride, a quiet moment together before heading off to start their new life. As they climbed into the cart, smiles still stretched across their faces. They had no idea that within moments, everything would shatter. The streets were mostly empty, the air cool and crisp. Samantha leaned her head on Eric's shoulder as the small vehicle moved forward. Then, in a split second, the night of celebration turned into chaos. A speeding car came out of nowhere, its engine roaring like a predator hunting its prey. The driver didn't slow down. There was no hesitation, no attempt to stop. The car slammed into the back of the golf cart at an unimaginable speed, launching it like a toy thrown by an angry child. The impact was devastating. Samantha was thrown from the cart, her white dress now covered in blood and dirt. Eric, still conscious but barely able to move, reached for her, his mind unable to process what had just happened. The golf cart lay in ruins, metal twisted, wheels bent in unnatural angles. Silence hung in the air for a moment before screams erupted from those who witnessed the horrifying scene. Emergency responders rushed to the site, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Paramedics ran to Samantha's lifeless body, but there was nothing they could do. She was gone. A young bride, full of life and love, had her future stolen in an instant. Eric, severely injured, was barely clinging to consciousness as he was rushed to the hospital. The woman behind the wheel of the car stood nearby, swaying unsteadily. Her name was Jamie Lee Komorowski. Her eyes were unfocused, her speech slurred. The smell of alcohol clung to her like a toxic cloud. She had been drinking heavily that night, ignoring the consequences of her choices. Her blood alcohol level was more than 3 times the legal limit. And yet, she had gotten into her car, convinced she could drive. She was wrong. When officers arrived, they immediately knew something was off. Jamie was stumbling, her words a mess of drunken confusion. She protested as they tested her for intoxication, her mood swinging from defiant to weeping. She insisted she wasn't that drunk, that she could handle herself. But the destruction around her told a different story. The wreckage, the broken bodies, the grief-stricken cries of wedding guests. Her actions had caused all of it. As the news spread, shockwaves rippled through the community. How could this have happened? A wedding, a day meant to be remembered for love and happiness, had turned into a crime scene. Samantha's family, still dressed in their wedding attire, were now facing the harsh reality that she was never coming back. Eric, barely able to speak, kept asking for his wife, refusing to believe that she was gone. The horror didn't end there. As investigators pieced together the events of that night, disturbing details emerged. Jamie had been drinking at multiple bars before getting behind a wheel. Surveillance footage showed her laughing, taking shots, and showing no concern for how much alcohol she had consumed. Her friends had even tried to stop her from driving, begging her to get a ride home. But she refused. She got into her car, and minutes later, she ended a life. The wedding decorations were still up when the news broke. The venue, once filled with happiness, now felt like a haunted place. Tables were still set, untouched plates of food left abandoned. The dance floor, where Samantha had twirled in her white dress just hours before, was now a reminder of a night that had gone horribly wrong. The scent of flowers still lingered in the air, but now they smelled like funeral arrangements instead of wedding bouquets. As investigators questioned Jamie, her attitude shifted from confusion to guilt. She broke down, sobbing, saying she never meant to hurt anyone. But it was too late. Her choices had taken a life, destroyed a family, and turned a celebration into a tragedy that no one would ever forget. And yet, this was only the beginning. The pain, the legal battles, the shattered dreams. What followed was even more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The hospital was a blur of lights and muffled voices. Machines beeped, doctors moved quickly, and the air smelled of antiseptic and sorrow. Eric Hutchinson lay on the hospital bed, his body broken, his mind still trapped in the nightmare of the crash. He barely remembered the impact, but he remembered her, Samantha, his beautiful wife, reaching for him in the dark. He kept waiting to hear her voice, expecting her to walk into the room, but she never did. The truth hit him harder than the crash itself. She was gone. The days that followed were filled with confusion, grief, and pain. Samantha's family was drowning in sorrow. Her mother, Lisa Miller, had to plan a funeral instead of celebrating her daughter's honeymoon. It didn't make sense. One moment, they were watching her dance in her wedding dress, and the next, they were picking out a casket. The weight of it was unbearable. Samantha had been more than just a bride. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was supposed to have a future, a family of her own. Now, all that remained were memories. Meanwhile, Jamie Lee Komorowski sat in a jail cell, her once carefree life shattered. She had been arrested on the scene, charged with reckless homicide and felony DUI. The reality of what she had done was sinking in, but it was too late to take it back. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Security footage from the bars showed her laughing, drinking, ignoring the warnings of her friends. Her blood alcohol level was 0.261, more than 3 times the legal limit. She had been speeding at 65 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour zone, her car a deadly weapon. Investigators pieced together the timeline of that night, uncovering even more chilling details. Jamie had been at multiple bars, drinking for hours. Text messages revealed that she had been bragging about how much she had consumed. Witnesses later said she showed no signs of slowing down, no concern about getting behind the wheel. When she left, she was so intoxicated that she barely made it to her car. Yet, she drove. As the case unfolded, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. Samantha's family was there, their pain visible in every tear-streaked face. Eric, still recovering from his injuries, sat silently, his expression unreadable. When Jamie was brought in, she looked different, no longer the carefree woman from that night, but a broken version of herself. She wept, shaking her head as the charges were read aloud. But tears wouldn't bring Samantha back. The prosecution presented a devastating case. They described the sheer recklessness of Jamie's actions, painting a picture of a woman who had every opportunity to make a different choice but didn't. They showed the footage, the speed calculations, the wreckage of the golf cart. Samantha's dress was displayed in court, once white, now stained with the evidence of that horrific night. The weight of it all was unbearable. Jamie's defense team tried to argue that she hadn't intended to kill anyone. She wasn't a monster, they said, just someone who had made a terrible mistake. But the courtroom was filled with people who had lost someone because of her choices. Mistake or not, Samantha was dead. When the sentence was announced, 25 years in prison, the room was silent for a moment before Samantha's mother let out a sob. It was justice, but it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. Jamie broke down as she was led away, her future now locked behind bars. She had been 25 years old, the same age as Samantha. 2 young women, 2 futures destroyed, one by death, the other by a choice that could never be undone. But the pain didn't stop there. In the aftermath of the sentencing, new wounds were opened. The legal battle between Eric and Samantha's mother turned what was already a tragedy into something even darker. The two had once shared the same grief, but now they were on opposite sides of a bitter lawsuit. The case wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about money, about control, about who had the right to make decisions in Samantha's name. Eric had filed a wrongful death lawsuit, seeking compensation for the unimaginable loss. But Samantha's mother argued that the settlement wasn't justice to claim. She believed that as Samantha's mother, she had a right to a share of whatever came from the case. What had started as shared grief now turned into something ugly. The courtroom, once a place of justice for Samantha, became a place of conflict. As the legal battle dragged on, the public watched in shock. How could something so tragic become even worse? Samantha had been the victim, yet now her name was at the center of a fight over money and rights. Her wedding had been the start of something beautiful, but now, even in death, she was caught in a storm of controversy. The emotional weight of it all was crushing. Eric, still trying to heal from both his physical injuries and the loss of his wife, now had to face accusations and legal disputes. Samantha's mother, once a grieving parent, now found herself painted as someone seeking financial gain. The media swarmed, headlines spinning the tragedy into a spectacle. Through it all, one fact remained. Samantha Miller was gone. She had been a bride for only a few hours before her life was stolen. And even after justice was served, after the tears, after the fights, the pain never truly ended. It lingered, a ghost that would never let go. The courtroom was filled with tension. Every seat was taken, and the air was thick with unspoken words. The grief, the anger, the deep wounds that had been ripped open, they all hung in the silence. On one side sat Eric Hutchinson, his face pale, his body still healing from the crash that had stolen his wife. On the other side sat Lisa Miller, Samantha's mother, her eyes hollow from endless nights of mourning. But today, they weren't standing together in their shared loss. They were fighting. The lawsuit had divided them. What should have been a time of healing had turned into a war over Samantha's memory. Lisa believed she had the right to part of the wrongful death settlement. After all, she had raised Samantha, loved her, protected her. But Eric, the man who had stood beside Samantha at the altar, the man who had held her as she took her last breath, felt that he was the one who had lost the most. He had been her husband. He was the one who had planned a life with her. Their battle played out in front of the world. Headlines screamed about the lawsuit, twisting the tragedy into a spectacle. People took sides, some supporting Eric, others defending Lisa. But in the middle of it all was Samantha, a woman who had never imagined that her death would become a source of such bitter conflict. As the legal proceedings dragged on, the pain deepened. Lisa accused Eric of being greedy, of trying to cut her out of her own daughter's legacy. Eric, in turn, claimed that Lisa was exploiting Samantha's death for money. The words were sharp, the accusations brutal. The same people who had once hugged each other in the aftermath of the crash now looked at each other with cold resentment. The trial unearthed secrets, things that had never been spoken before. Text messages between Samantha and her mother were brought into evidence, showing cracks in their relationship that no one had seen before. Disagreements, old wounds, things that had never been fully healed. Now they were on display for the world to see. But nothing was more painful than the moment Eric was asked to describe the night of the crash. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke, his voice shaking. He described the joy of the wedding, the feeling of holding Samantha's hand, the way her laughter had filled the night air. Then he described the crash, the sound of metal twisting, the weightlessness as they were thrown, the unbearable silence that followed. He told them how he had reached for her, his fingers barely brushing her skin before she was gone. Lisa wept as she listened, but she didn't back down. She wanted justice, not just for Samantha's death, but for herself. She felt she had been pushed aside, ignored, treated as if her pain didn't matter. Eric, meanwhile, just wanted it all to end. He had lost his wife. He couldn't lose himself in the fight. Outside the courtroom, the world continued to move on, but for those involved, time had stopped. Samantha's name was no longer just attached to a wedding or a tragedy. It was now tied to a bitter dispute, one that threatened to overshadow everything else. Meanwhile, Jamie Lee Komorowski sat in her prison cell, her world reduced to gray walls and regret. She had plenty of time to think about that night, about the choices that had led her here. She had once been free, living her life without a care in the world. Now, her future stretched out before her in years of confinement. She had taken a life, destroyed a family, and no amount of apologies could change that. Prison guards watched as she sat on her cot, staring at the walls. Sometimes she cried. Other times, she just sat in silence, replaying the events over and over again. The moment she got behind the wheel, the way the car had moved too fast, the sickening impact, the screaming, the flashing lights, the handcuffs. It was all there, trapped in her mind, a nightmare she couldn't escape. Letters poured in, some from strangers who hated her, who wished the worst upon her. Others came from people who had lost loved ones to drunk drivers, begging her to understand the depth of what she had done. Some came from her own family, telling her they still loved her, that they were praying for her. But nothing could undo what had happened. Back outside, Eric visited Samantha's grave. He ran his fingers over her name, the letters carved into cold stone. He whispered to her, telling her things she would never hear. He told her how much he missed her, how much he wished he could go back, how the world felt empty without her. He told her about the lawsuit, about the anger and the pain. He asked her what he should do, but the only answer was the wind rustling through the trees. Lisa visited too, but at different times. She sat by the grave, pressing her hand against the stone as if she could still feel her daughter there. She talked to Samantha, telling her about the court battles, about the things that had been said. She asked if she was doing the right thing, but no answer came. The world kept turning, but for them, time had stopped. In the end, there were no true winners, only shattered lives, broken hearts, and a future that would never be. What was supposed to be a day of love and celebration had turned into a nightmare that no one could wake up from. Samantha Miller had been a bride for just a few short hours before her life was stolen in the most tragic way possible. The pain of her loss spread like ripples in a pond, touching everyone she had ever known. Eric would carry the weight of that night forever. No matter how much time passed, he would always be the groom who lost his bride before their journey even began. Lisa Miller would never hold her daughter again, never see her grow into the life she had dreamed of. Jamie Lee Komorowski would spend years behind bars, haunted by the reality of what she had done. This story is a devastating reminder of how one reckless decision can destroy lives in an instant. Drunk driving doesn't just ruin the life of the driver. It leaves families broken, dreams shattered, and future stolen. If you made it this far, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about this heartbreaking case? And if you want more gripping true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Like this video if you believe Samantha's story deserves to be heard. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.